So if there is no regime or treaty or mechanism to control use of drones, it's something which is extremely dangerous and it's just out there. And worst of all is that US has set precedent for use of drones outside the territory of war zones.
You're watching The World from Below. I'm Lizzie O'Shea, and that was Pakistani lawyer Shahzad Akbar, who represents victims of Pakistani drone attacks. We're joined today by Professor Richard Tanter and Emily Howie from the Human Rights Law Centre discussing Pine Gap and the drone wars. Shahzad Akbar, who we just heard from in that clip, condemned the tracking of communications through Pine Gap when he was in Australia last year. Akbar went on to say that this enables the US to target those militants with its drone strikes. He called for greater transparency on the use of drones. The Bureau of Investigative Journalism estimates that between 2,700 and 4,300 people have been killed in drone strikes in Pakistan, Yemen and Somalia over the last decade. Richard, what is the drone program about?
Well, drones are formally called unmanned aerial vehicles. They are operated from two locations usually, one very close to their targets where they take off from which they take off and land, and then they're handed over to controllers who are usually based in the middle of the United States. They operate with a global communication system. That's a critical part of it. The armed drones, particularly the big ones, so-called MQ-9 Reapers, carry very powerful missiles. They have very powerful cameras. They're supplied with intelligence from places like Pine Gap and other imagery and signals intelligence, and they kill from a very, very long way away, essentially the other side of the world. This is a typical example of the West's preference for risk-averse warfare. No one gets hurt except the people who are targeted. The United States says, well, there are always going to be some collateral damage, by which they mean people they didn't intend to kill. These are turning out to be many more people than we're told about before. More importantly, the United States has a great number of drone bases in our part of the world, particularly in the Indian Ocean, in the Seychelles, in Afghanistan, in parts of the Yemen and Somalia. It's now expanding through Africa. So these aircraft, these drones, are really operating on a huge scale now. And many of the places in which they're operating, Somalia, Pakistan, Yemen, are certainly countries from which the United States is not at war, and certainly Australia is not at war, and therefore it seems to be pretty clear that killing people there is simply murder. You might want to call it extrajudicial killing, but it's basically assassination.
I do want to ask for that. Emily, what is the international law governing drone strikes?
Yeah, I think that I'd probably put it in a slightly more nuanced way than Richard, just to reflect what is a real debate amongst international law academics. I mean, there's international humanitarian law, which is the law of war, that can apply, and which the United States says does apply because it is at war with Al-Qaeda and its associates.
Wherever that may be,
wherever that may be, and for whatever period of time that may continue. So they certainly argue that the laws of war apply, and international human rights law will apply whether or not there is a war going on as well. So under humanitarian law, the law of war, you cannot target civilians, and the real concern is that drones are targeting civilians in a way that's unlawful. And also under human rights law, you have a right to life, and the concern is that people's right to life is just being taken from them in an unnecessary and disproportionate way. So they're the real concerns. Under both of those types of law, though, there needs to be an independent and impartial investigation into the deaths that occur, and that is not happening. Right. These drone killings are happening in secret.
Another way of thinking about it is probably just as unnuanced, but it's going to be really important. This is something that we do, Australia and the United States, do at the moment, United States, obviously. We're not going to like it when China does the same thing, when Iran does the same thing. Iran and China are both working very hard with UAVs, with drones at the moment. China has its own views on the war on terror, focusing on its own citizens, Uyghurs principally. We should be asking a fairly basic, sensible, strategic question. are we going to like it when it's done to us? And the answer is very clearly no. And some of those legal issues that Emily quite rightly was raising are going to get answered very firmly in the negative.
Yeah, I want to pick up on that point because I want to show you a clip of the parents of 27-year-old Australian Christopher Harvard, who was killed by a missile from a drone strike while he was travelling in the remote east of Yemen.
How do we move on? We got no closure. We got no proof of Chris's body or death certificate or how he was actually killed. So how can you move on?
What do you want from the Australian government?
The truth.
The truth.
The straight out truth. No lies. The straight out truth.
So this makes Christopher Harvard the first Australian citizen that we know about who has been killed in a drone strike. Emily, what facts do we know about the death of Christopher Harvard?
Unfortunately, we don't know very much at all about how Christopher Harvard died. We know that in November last year, he, along with another Australian citizen, was killed in a US drone strike in Yemen. And we've been provided almost no information by the Australian government about the circumstances of that death. All the Australian government has said is that it had no prior knowledge of and no involvement in their deaths. This is so woefully unacceptable. We've got 2 Australian citizens that have died, and our government should be calling on the US government or assisting the US government to investigate how and why they died. Instead, what we have are these unofficial sources of information that tell us what is very unreliable, could be scuttlebutt about these men, why they were in Yemen, whether or not they were collateral damage or actually targeted. It's not acceptable. The government should be assisting this family to get the information that they need.
It's interesting because obviously the activities at Pine Gap go on with full knowledge and concurrence of the Australian US government, and then we're told that there's allegations that it's used in the drone program, and then that Australia has no prior knowledge of the death of Christopher Harvard or the drone strike that precipitated his death. It's a bit hard to believe, would you say?
Yeah, I mean, it does make you wonder what full knowledge and concurrence means. And maybe Richard would have a better kind of technical idea of what this means, but it's possible that the Australian government may not have known about this. And I think from the Human Rights Law Centre's point of view, the real concern at the moment is not only that those 2 men were killed, but that the response of the Australian government has not been to give their families the process that they need to understand why that happened. I mean, the US has essentially taken the lives of 2 Australian citizens. If they were wanted for terror-related offences, then they should have been brought before a court of law. They should not be assassinated abroad.
I want to show you both another clip actually of Jeremy Scahill, the filmmaker and an activist, really, and author on this topic, about the response of the Australian government to the revelations that we're discussing.
And what we've seen is Prime Minister Tony Abbott in Australia and the Prime Minister of New Zealand, John Key, both sort of with a deafening silence in the face of their citizens being killed, but also supporting the U.S. drone program. John Key recently saying that it's an effective form of prosecution. So what we know is that the governments of Australia and New Zealand have done nothing to try to inquire from the United States why 2 of their citizens were effectively given the death penalty when they hadn't been charged with crimes.
Richard, can you tell me, what's your assessment of the allegation that Australia is implicated in the killing of civilians through Pine Gap?
Well, we certainly know from the testimony of David Rosenberg, former NSA contractor who worked at Pine Gap for a long time, that for a number of years Pine Gap has been involved in counter-terrorism surveillance. That's principally through picking up cell phone transmissions, satellite phone transmissions, then passing them on to the wider US military targeting system. We don't know in particular cases whether the satellites which Pine Gap downlinks picked up the data that resulted in targeted killing X or Y. We can make some inferences from the geographical location of that because the satellites that Pine Gap downlinks from are known. There are some areas where it may be Pine Gap or it may be the British equivalent, Menwith Hill. either way, the system of which Pine Gap is an absolutely critical part, a major critical part, is involved in this. The Americans are quite clear about this. We know a great deal about how that functions. The particulars we have to wait for, but Emily is absolutely right that if the Australian government is going to maintain that it operates with the full knowledge and concurrence of the government, then when Australian citizens are killed, when New Zealand citizens are killed, when American citizens are killed, or when civilians in countries with which we are not at war are killed, then the Australian public should be able to ask, what are we doing there? I suspect the Minister for Defence, in this case David Johnson, in the Labor case Stephen Smith didn't know much about it in the Harvard case because they don't inquire very much about it. However, the Assistant Secretary of Defence, who is the Deputy Chief there, would certainly know, would certainly have been involved in planning, if not that act, that surveillance run, if you like, or that surveillance operation. It certainly would have known similar ones, and that's what we need to know. What in general are they doing, and really what is the government's attitude to the responsibility for this huge American facility on our soil? It's been there for half a century. It's time that, firstly, the Australian government told us what the American government tells its public, its Congress, which is much more. But secondly, the kind of questions that Emily and her colleagues are asking about actual culpability really have to be faced up to. We can't just say, well, this is national security. There's very little in conceivable genuine national security that could be compromised by making clear what happened in this and similar kind of instances. That's a screen they hide behind.
So Jeremy Scahill talked about the effective silence, really, of Tony Abbott on this point. I want to show you another clip, actually, of Senator Scott Ludlam from the Greens raising the case of Christopher Harvard, who we were just discussing, with the Attorney General George Brandis.
It's relating to a US drone strike that killed 2 Australian citizens, or 1 Australian citizen and 1 dual citizen, late last year in Yemen, on the 19th of November, I think. Senator Brandis, when did you hear of that strike?
I can't comment on those matters, Senator, you know that.
Why is that?
Because I can't, you know that.
What, you're just refusing to?
Well, I'm not at liberty to.
Why?
Because under the conventions and practices of the Parliament, if you don't know that, Senator, you should, and now you do.
So tell us, Emily, how difficult is it to get information about Pine Gap?
It's really difficult. We at the Human Rights Law Centre are very keen to get more information about the involvement of Australia in the drone program through Pine Gap and the legal basis, and it has been very difficult to get any of that information. Senator Ludlam and Senate estimates is really one of the best opportunities that we have to get information, and you can see how the minister responsible is dealing with those questions. I mean, there are barriers put up about operational reasons and intelligence matters that make it an effective wall against getting information that is absolutely critical. So there are things like freedom of information requests, but again, the government has the ability to call on operational matters and intelligent matters to prevent disclosure of information that it would consider to be damaging.
We're going to take a quick break and we'll be back to talk further about the role of Pine Gap in mass surveillance. Stay with us.